She was 23, and for all practical purposes, homeless. With no family left to claim her, no money to sustain her, and no plan to guide her. She had only a small, heavy iron key in her pocket and the few pounds she had refused to leave behind. And with that, she accepted the deed to Ravenscar Keep, a worthless ruin on the Northumberland coast. But what nobody knew, least of all the Duke who signed it away like a bad debt, was that hidden within the keep's sealed sea tower was a secret that would not only change her life, but resurrect the very stones around her. Settle in with us for this story, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Laura Harding had grown up with the scent of damp earth and old books in her nostrils. Harding Hall, her family home, was a place of gentle, scholarly decay, much like her father. He was a kind man, a gentleman farmer more interested in Roman history than crop rotation, and the estate had slowly crumbled under his benign neglect. Her older brother, Thomas, possessed none of their father's gentleness, only a sharp, resentful ambition that had curdled in the face of their diminishing fortunes. He had always looked at Laura not as a sister, but as another mouth to feed, another cost in the ledger he kept in his mind. Her quiet competence, her ability to manage a household with a fraction of the resources his wife required, seemed only to irritate him further. Their mother had died when Laura was just a girl, leaving behind a memory as faint and fragrant as pressed flowers in a book. The only person who had truly seen Laura, who had cultivated the strength within her, was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable was a widow from a nearby village, a woman whose hands were as capable as her words were few. She had run Harding Hall for 30 years, and she taught Laura how to run it too. Not the drawing room skills of needlepoint and watercolor, but the vital, practical arts of survival. She taught Laura how to mend linen so the seam was stronger than the cloth, how to preserve summer fruit in sugar and winter vegetables in salt, how to read a ledger and make the columns balance. She taught her to identify the spiderweb cracks of dry rot in a beam, the telltale sag of a roof holding too much water, the precise mix of lime and sand needed to patch crumbling plaster. "A house has bones, Laura," Mrs. Gable would say, her voice as steady as her gaze. "It breathes and it settles. Learn its bones, and it will keep you warm when all else is cold." After Laura's mother passed, the two of them had taken over the tending of the old walled garden, a place of tangled roses and forgotten herbs her mother had loved. Mrs. Gable had given Laura the key, a heavy piece of iron, ornate and rusted. "A good lock means a safe wall," she'd said, "and a safe wall means a place to grow." When her father died suddenly from a fever that swept the county, the house and its debts passed entirely to Thomas. The key in Laura's pocket became a useless relic. Thomas, at his new wife's insistence, had the locks on the garden gate changed immediately. But Laura kept it. It was a tangible piece of her mother's love and Mrs. Gable's plain-spoken wisdom, a small, solid weight in a world that was rapidly becoming unstable. The end of her old life came not with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful farewell, but in the stale, airless quiet of a solicitor's office in Alnwick. The room smelled of sealing wax and decaying paper. Mr. Davies, a man with a face like worn leather who had managed her family's affairs since she was a child, cleared his throat and avoided her eyes. Her brother Thomas was not present. He had dispatched his solicitor to deliver the final terms, an act of administrative cruelty that felt more wounding than any shouted words. Mr. Davies read from the letter in a monotone. Thomas and his wife were prepared to offer her a final settlement of £50. In exchange, she was to relinquish any and all future claims upon the Harding name or estate, and remove herself from the county. The sum was presented as a kindness, a stipend to assist her in securing a position as a governess or a lady's companion, preferably at a great distance. £50. It was the price of her erasure. Laura sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap over her worn gloves. She looked at the sum written on the paper and felt a cold, hard clarity settle over her. To accept the money would be to accept their valuation of her, to agree that she was a problem to be paid off and dismissed. "No, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the dusty room. Mr. Davies looked up, surprised. "Miss Harding, it is a generous offer. Your brother is not legally obligated." "I understand," she interrupted softly, "but I will not take it." A long silence followed. Mr. Davies shuffled his papers, a flicker of something, pity or perhaps just weariness, crossing his features. He was an old man, and this was an ugly business, he sighed. "There is another matter," he said, pulling a different document from a pile. "A small debt your father owed to the Duke of Alderton. Not a monetary one, but a matter of a tenant-in-chief responsibility that was never settled. His Grace is aware of your circumstances." He paused. "He has offered to forgive the debt and sign over the deed to a property on the coast. It is called Ravenscar Keep." He looked at her over the top of his spectacles. "I must be clear, Miss Harding. It is a ruin. It has been uninhabitable for the better part of a century. It is considered a liability, a pile of stones on a cliff. The Duke is, in effect, simply ridding himself of it." A ruin, a pile of stones. The words should have sounded like the final toll of a bell, the confirmation of her destitution. But instead, a thought surfaced, clear and strong as Mrs. Gable's voice. A house has bones. She could live a life of dependent servitude, her existence hanging on the whims of strangers, or she could have a pile of stones that belonged to her and her alone. It was not a choice between comfort and hardship, but between a gilded cage and a broken fortress. "I will accept the deed," Laura said. The decision settled in her chest, not with a flutter of hope, but with the solid weight of resolve. She signed the papers where Mr. Davies indicated. She left the solicitor's office with the deed to Ravenscar Keep in her satchel, the old iron garden key in her pocket, and the £4.10 that constituted her entire worldly fortune. The £50, her brother's payment for her disappearance, remained untouched on the polished mahogany desk. The journey north to the coast was a slow, rattling immersion into the landscape that was now her home. She traveled on the back of a carrier's cart, driven by a man named Silas, whose silence seemed as ancient and weathered as the gray stone walls that lined the muddy lanes. The Northumberland countryside unrolled before her in a tapestry of late autumn hues, the faded gold of harvested fields, the deep, bruised purple of the distant Cheviot hills, the stark black of skeletal trees against a sky the color of slate. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the scent of damp earth, burning coal, and eventually, a faint, briny tang that promised the sea. She spent one night at a small coaching inn, the price of a bed and a bowl of pottage making a significant dent in her meager funds. But the warmth of the fire and the brief respite from the jolting cart were a necessary mercy. Silas, who had barely spoken a dozen words in 2 days, finally gestured with his chin towards the horizon as they crested a hill on the second afternoon. "Brandmere, down in the cove," he grunted. "Ravenscar's up on the headland. The crow's nest, we call it." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Wind'll take the hair from your head up there. No one's lived in it since the French wars. Folks say it's haunted by the sea. The fishing village of Brindmere was a cluster of stone cottages, huddled together as if for warmth, their roofs slick with rain and sea spray. The air was thick with the smells of salt, tarred rope, and drying fish. Men in heavy wool jerseys mended nets on the shingle beach, their movements economical and sure, their faces carved by wind and water. They watched her pass with open curiosity, their eyes lingering on her town clothes, so out of place in this world of hard, practical work. The final part of her journey was on foot. Silas helped her unload her small trunk, accepted her offered shillings with a nod, and turned his cart around without another word. The track up to the headland was steep and treacherous, a ribbon of mud and stone winding through wind-blasted gorse and heather. She had to stop every few hundred feet, her breath coming in ragged plumes, her hands raw from the trunk's rope handle. The wind was a physical force, a relentless, pressing weight that stole the warmth from her body and roared in her ears. And then she saw it. Ravenscar Keep was not a romantic ruin. It was a skeleton. It stood silhouetted against the churning gray sea, a jagged collection of broken walls and the dark, defiant pillar of a single tower. It looked less like a castle than a geological formation, a set of broken teeth gnashed against the sky. The sense of desolation was absolute, a profound and lonely emptiness that seemed to mirror the one in her own heart. Yet, as she stood there, the wind whipping her cloak around her, a strange and unfamiliar feeling took root beneath the fear. It was the stark, simple, and powerful realization that this desolation, this pile of broken stones, was hers. She walked through what had once been a gatehouse, now just two moss-covered stone stumps flanking a gap in the crumbling curtain wall. The central courtyard was a wilderness of rubble and tenacious coastal weeds. The main hall stood open to the sky, its great roof long since collapsed. The floor a treacherous landscape of fallen slates, rotting timbers, and soil deep enough for sea pinks and hardy grasses to have taken root. It was a garden of decay. To one side, a range of buildings that might have been the kitchens and servants' quarters was in a marginally better state. A section of roof, constructed not of slate but of heavy, overlapping stone slabs, still held, though the timbers beneath it sagged ominously. The great kitchen fireplace was a hollow cavern choked with debris and the accumulated nests of generations of jackdaws. But it was the sea tower that dominated the ruin. It was a massive, round peel tower, built of dark, almost black stone, standing at the very edge of the cliff, as if in defiance of the sea itself. It seemed the most solid part of the entire structure, its stones fitted together with a precision that had withstood centuries of gales. The ground floor entrance, however, was completely impassable, blocked by a solid mass of collapsed masonry and rubble, sealed tight as a tomb. Laura focused her attention on the more sheltered kitchen wing, searching for a space that could offer some refuge from the relentless wind. She found it in what must have been a small pantry or buttery. The room was no larger than a closet, but it had 4 solid walls, a floor of hard-packed earth, and a ceiling that, for the most part, seemed intact. The only window was a narrow stone slit, which had been crudely boarded over from the inside, plunging the space into near-total darkness. It was cold, damp, and smelled of wet stone, salt, and the slow, patient process of decay. But it was shelter. That first night, she huddled in the corner of the tiny room, wrapped in every layer of clothing she owned, her small trunk pushed against the doorway to block the worst of the drafts. She ate the last of her bread and cheese by the light of a single precious candle, its small flame flickering wildly in the currents of air that found their way through 100 hidden cracks. She had used her last few shillings in the village to buy the candle, along with a loaf of bread and a small wedge of hard cheese. The woman in the small shop had looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The people of Brandmere, she was beginning to understand, viewed the keep as a place of death and misfortune, and anyone foolish enough to go near it was already halfway to being a ghost. As the North Sea crashed against the cliffs below, a sound like the breathing of some immense sleeping beast, Laura felt a fear so profound it was almost paralyzing. But beneath the fear, the words of Mrs. Gable echoed, a small, steady light in the overwhelming dark. A house has bones. This place had bones. They were broken and exposed, but they were strong, and they were hers. The first weeks were a lesson in the stark realities of survival. Laura's days fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity. Hauling water from a spring-fed well she discovered in a sheltered corner of the courtyard, gathering driftwood from the cove below the cliffs for fuel, and rationing her dwindling food supplies. Her first priority was her small sanctuary. With a piece of salvaged iron she used as a pry bar, she worked the boards from the window slit, letting in a sliver of the perpetual gray coastal light. She spent 2 full days clearing the rubble from the small room, her hands becoming chapped and raw. She used a flat piece of slate to scrape the packed earth floor level and swept it clean with a makeshift broom of bundled heather. It remained a cold stone box, but it became an orderly one. Once her small space was secured, she turned her attention to the rest of the ruin, not with any grand notion of rebuilding, but with the practical aim of salvage. She began to clear the debris from the roofless great hall, sorting the fallen stones by size and the broken timbers by their soundness. It was grueling, back-breaking labor. She learned the heft and balance of stone, the sharp, splintering protest of wet, rotten wood. Every evening, she would fall onto her bed of straw and blankets, every muscle in her body aching with a deep, exhaustive pain. But through it all, her thoughts kept returning to the sea tower. The blockage at its base was an enigma. The more she looked at it, the more convinced she became that it was not the result of a simple, random collapse. The stones were too tightly packed, the gaps filled with a hard, gray mortar unlike the crumbling lime mortar elsewhere in the keep. It looked deliberate, intentional, as if someone had walled it up from the outside. Remembering Mrs. Gable's advice to learn a house's structure, she began to search for another way in. A high, narrow window was visible from the courtyard, but it was 20 feet up a sheer wall, utterly inaccessible. She walked the outer perimeter of the tower day after day, her hands tracing the cold, damp contours of the massive stones, searching for any sign of a hidden entrance, a different weakness. The discovery, when it came, was from within. She had been clearing the enormous fireplace in the great hall, the one that backed onto the tower wall. As she wrestled with a large, fallen lintel stone, her iron bar slipped, striking the soot-blackened stone at the back of the hearth. Instead of the dull thud of solid rock, the sound was a deep, resonant boom. It rang hollow. A thrill, sharp and immediate, shot through her. Forgetting her exhaustion, she began to work at the mortar around the huge stones of the fireplace back. It was the work of days, chipping away with her bar and a smaller pointed stone, her arms and shoulders screaming in protest. Finally, one of the central stones shifted. With a last, desperate effort, she levered it out. It fell forward with a crash, revealing not solid earth or rubble, but a square of absolute darkness. She had found a way through. After widening the hole enough to squeeze her shoulders through, She lit a fresh candle and crawled into the opening. She found herself not in the main ground floor chamber of the tower, but in a small hidden cell, its stone floor swept clean. It was a space that existed between the walls. In the center of the chamber sat a heavy, sea-worn wooden chest, its corners bound with rust-pitted iron. It was not locked. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry, fragrant seaweed, were several canvas bags, heavy with the unmistakable weight of coin. Beneath them, a small leather pouch held a handful of milky, irregular pearls, and under it all lay a tin document box. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a letter. The ink faded but still perfectly legible, written in a neat, careful script. Beside it lay a small object, a carving of a seabird, its wooden form worn smooth and dark by the touch of a hand. By the flickering candlelight, her heart pounding against her ribs, Laura read the letter. To whomever finds this place, it is yours now. My name was Elspeth Reed. I was the wife of Captain Thomas Reed, the last keeper of this place for the Duke. My Thomas was lost at sea in the American wars. His ship, the North Star, gone down in a storm off the Carolinas in the year of our Lord, 1781. I remained here. The Duke's agent in Alnwick ceased to call. I believe they forgot a widow lived upon this cliff. Fearing for my safety, and for the small wealth my good husband left me, I had the tower sealed by my own hand, and with the help of a trusted man from the village, now long past. I write this in the year 1785. I have no kin to leave this to. Use it to make these old stones a home again. They have kept me safe. May they do the same for you. The sea gives and the sea takes, but the land holds fast. I lived here for 30 years. The discovery of Elspeth Reed's legacy transformed Laura's world. The gold sovereigns and silver shillings were not merely money, they were potential, a future, the means to honor the trust of a woman she would never know. She was no longer a destitute survivor clinging to a rock. She was the custodian of Ravenscar, armed with the resources to heal its wounds. The money was not a key to escape this harsh, wind-swept place, but the mortar that could bind it back together. The next morning, she walked down the steep track to Brynmere. The wind still pulled at her shawl, the sea still crashed below, but she walked with a new purpose. Her steps were firm, her gaze direct. She sought out the cottage of Arthur Finch, the village mason. He was an old man, his hands gnarled into claws by arthritis, but his eyes were the clear, sharp blue of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. She found him sitting by his door, sharpening a chisel on a whetstone. She did not reveal the extent of her fortune. She simply asked to hire him and his son, a strong, quiet young man also named Thomas, for a week's work. She offered a fair wage in good silver shillings, which she counted into his palm. Their first task, she explained, was to properly and safely unseal the main entrance to the sea tower. Arthur Finch looked from the silver in his hand to her face, his expression one of deep skepticism, but work was work, and the pay was good. He and his son arrived the next day with their barrows, hammers, and pry bars. As they began to dismantle the blockage, Arthur confirmed Laura's suspicion. "This weren't no collapse, miss," he said, pointing with his chisel. "This was built, deliberate. See how the stones are keyed in? Someone wanted this shut for good." The sound of their hammers on stone echoed across the headland, a ringing announcement that Ravenscar was stirring from its long slumber. The work drew the attention of the village. Soon, Laura hired others. Silas, the carrier, was contracted to make regular trips to Alnwick. His cart laden with lime for mortar, seasoned timber planks, panes of glass carefully packed in straw, and sacks of coal. She hired a carpenter, a quiet widower named Mr. Blackwood, who had lost 2 sons to the fishing fleet. He came to inspect the sagging roof of the kitchen wing, his expert eye assessing the great oak beams. "The damp's got the ends, miss," he reported, "but the heartwood is sound. Good as the day it was felled. We can scarf in new timbers. It'll hold for another 100 years." Laura did not simply give orders from a distance. She worked alongside them, hauling away rubble in a wicker basket, mixing mortar in a shallow pit until her arms ached, learning the names of their tools and the rhythm of their work. She listened to their advice, deferring to their long experience with the local stone and the battering coastal weather. She managed the project with the quiet, observant competence Mrs. Gable had instilled in her, her small ledger book filling with accounts for wages, materials, and transport, all neatly balanced. The community began to form not through words, but through shared labor. Arthur Finch's wife would send up a hot meat pie or a pot of stew for her men's midday meal, and always included an extra portion for Laura. One of the fishermen, returning with a good catch of cod, left 3 gleaming fish on the stone slab by her door. They saw she was not a foolish lady playing at being a castaway. They saw the calluses on her hands and the smudges of lime on her dress. They understood, in a way her own family never could, the deep, fundamental drive to build a safe harbor against the storm. The focus of their work was on the kitchen wing and the sea tower. The great hall was cleared and left as a sheltered, 3-walled courtyard. Under the skilled hands of the Finches and Mr. Blackwood, the kitchen wing was transformed. The roof was made sound, the gaping holes filled with new gray slate that matched the old. Glazed window frames were set into the stone openings, and a sturdy oak door was hung. Inside, the fireplaces were cleared and their flues made to draw properly. The sea tower, once unsealed, was revealed to be a magnificent space. The ground floor was a single, large, circular room with a fireplace big enough to roast an ox. A winding stone staircase, its steps worn into shallow bowls by centuries of use, led up to 2 more rooms, each with commanding views of the sea and the rugged coastline. Word of her fair wages and prompt payment spread through Brynmere. Miss Harding of Ravenscar, the strange girl from inland, was becoming a known quantity, a person of substance and sense. A year can be a lifetime. In the space of 4 seasons, Ravenscar Keep was reborn. The kitchen wing, once a collection of damp, derelict rooms, was now a warm and functional home. Smoke curled from its newly capped chimneys, a friendly plume of gray against the often leaden sky. The windows, once dark voids, now held the soft, welcoming glow of lamplight in the evenings. The sea tower had become Laura's private domain. The vast ground floor room, with its great hearth, served as her study and sitting room. The floor was covered with thick, woven rush mats, and the stone walls were lined with sturdy shelves Mr. Blackwood had built for her few books and the ones she began to acquire. The rooms above became her bedchamber and a well-stocked pantry. The once ruined great hall was now a sheltered kitchen garden. Following the advice of Mrs. Finch and her own memories of Mrs. Gable's practices, Laura had directed the building of raised beds using salvaged stone and timber. She filled them with soil enriched with seaweed hauled up from the cove, creating a fertile patch protected from the worst of the wind by the high stone walls. Here she grew hardy, essential things: kale and cabbages, potatoes and leeks, turnips and carrots that thrived in the cool, salty air. She was no longer an outsider in Brynmere. She was a fixture, a part of the village's daily life. She bought her flour, salt, and tea from the village shop, and her orders helped keep the small enterprise afloat through the lean winter. When the vicar, a young earnest man named Mr. Allen, made a collection for repairs to the ancient church roof, her contribution was the largest. He began to call on her once a month, impressed by her quiet intelligence and the remarkable transformation she had wrought. The village children, who had once whispered stories of the ghost of the crow's nest, now saw it as a place of curiosity and warmth. They would sometimes leave her small gifts on the doorstep: a string of iridescent seashells, a bird's feather of unusual color, a handful of wild berries. She, in turn, would thank them with a freshly baked oatcake or a shiny red apple from Silas's cart. A small, unspoken ritual had formed between her and the fisherman. On stormy nights, when the sea turned to a maelstrom of black water and white foam, she would light a bright lantern and place it in the highest window of the sea tower. It was not a lighthouse, not an official beacon, but a small point of light, a promise of a steadfast presence on the cliff. It was a gesture of kinship, a silent acknowledgement of Elspeth Reed's lost captain and of all the men who risked their lives on that water. The fisherman, seeing that small, steady glow through the lashing rain, would feel a measure of comfort. It meant someone was watching, that their village extended even to the lonely headland. Eventually, rumors of the miracle at Ravenscar reached the Duke of Alderton. He was in the county for the autumn shooting, and the stories of the penniless young woman who had supposedly resurrected his worthless ruin piqued his curiosity. Dismissing it as local exaggeration, he decided to ride out one afternoon to see for himself. He expected to find, at best, a slightly tidier pile of stones. What he found stunned him into silence. He saw a living home. He saw smoke and glazed windows and a sturdy new gate being hung by Thomas Finch. He saw Laura, her hair tied back from her face, dressed not in silks, but in a practical dress of dark wool, conferring with the young mason about the precise alignment of an iron hinge. The Duke dismounted, his expression one of utter disbelief. "Miss Harding," he began, his voice betraying his astonishment. "How is this possible?" Laura simply turned to him, her expression calm and untroubled. "The old stones are very good, Your Grace," she replied, her voice even. "They just needed some attention." She offered no other explanation. She did not speak of the gold or of Elspeth Reed. She let him believe it was done through sheer will and hard work alone, which was, in its own way, the greater part of the truth. He left a short time later, profoundly puzzled and deeply impressed. The following week, he returned with his wife, the Duchess, whose amazement was even greater than his. The story of the quiet, determined young woman who had tamed Ravenscar Keep became not just a village rumor, but a county legend. One evening in late autumn, almost 2 years after her arrival, Laura stood in the uppermost room of the sea tower. A gale was blowing from the northeast, a wild elemental force that rattled the window frames and sent waves crashing against the cliffs with a sound like cannon fire. The wind howled around the tower, a mournful ancient song. But inside, the thick stone walls held firm, and the room was a sanctuary of warmth and quiet. Her lantern was lit in the window, its steady beam cutting a small path through the tumultuous dark. Below, in the main room of the tower, a good fire of sea-seasoned oak crackled and spat in the great hearth. On the heavy stone mantelpiece above it, 2 small objects sat side by side. One was the little wooden seabird, its shape worn into a smooth, comforting curve by Elspeth Reed's lonely vigil. The other was the heavy, rusted iron key to a walled garden at Harding Hall, a place she could never enter again. They were tokens from the two most important women in her life, the one who had given her birth and the one who had given her a future. She thought of Mrs. Gable, whose practical wisdom had been a far greater inheritance than any land or title. Learn its bones, and it will keep you warm. Ravenscar's bones had been strong, and she had trusted them. She had learned their every angle, their every weakness, their every strength, and they, in turn, had kept her safe and warm. A fortress not only against the northern gales, but against the cold indifference of the world. She thought of her brother Thomas and his wife, still rattling around in the increasingly dilapidated grandeur of Harding Hall, selling off parcels of land to pay their debts, their ambition turning as sour as bad wine. In their haste to be rid of her, they had given her the one thing they imagined to be entirely worthless. They had given her a pile of stones, and from those stones, she had built a life. From the ruin, she had raised a home. The light in the window was more than just a lamp. It was a statement. It was a declaration that this place was no longer abandoned, no longer a haunt for ghosts and ill fortune. It was a home, a place of purpose and of peace. She was no longer Laura Harding, the dispossessed daughter, the poor relation. She was Miss Harding of Ravenscar. And the people in the village below, seeing her light shine out into the storm, knew that the keeper was in her keep, watchful and steadfast. Laura Harding was 23 when she was given a ruin on a cliff. She had £4 to her name and a deed to a pile of stones no one wanted. It was the best inheritance she could have ever received. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found a quiet strength in Laura's journey, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might appreciate it. It helps our small channel continue to tell stories like this. And now we leave you with a question to ponder. What have you, in your own life, built from something that others considered worthless?